And we're good.
Good to go. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the third session of our ForecastNL series. I'm Rob Greenwood, Director of the Harris Center and Associate VP Public Engagement and External Relations for Memorial University. It's most appropriate that we're all here together for our next ForecastNL session, as today is Earth Day. So great to be together for that. It's also my son's birthday, so happy birthday, Luke. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located this afternoon now, and to consider the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. Our past sessions introduced the project itself and then look closely at the environmental impacts of climate change on Newfoundland and Labrador. Today, we'll be looking at how climate change specifically impacts our economy. We've carved out 18 months for this project, so these first few sessions have been looking at these topics in rather broad strokes. We will be returning to each of these issues, Newfoundland and Labrador's environment, economy, and society, in much more detail during future sessions. So stay tuned for that. If it feels like a topic was raised but not discussed in detail, don't worry. We're taking lots of notes on all the topics that get raised, and we'll be having lots more sessions to drill into the details. But if you'd like to make any suggestions on topics, we're open to that too. Just send us a note in the chat box or the Q&A, or send us an email anytime. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. Joining us for our kickoff session on the economy are Kieran Hanley, Dr. Deetra Walsh, and Elizabeth Beale. I have short bios. Elizabeth is an economist who has been an advisor to government and industry on economic strategies for Atlantic Canada throughout her career, authoring numerous studies on regional development, labor market, and trade topics. She held position of president and CEO of the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council, APEC, from 1996 until her retirement in 2015. She has remained active in Canadian public policy as a commissioner of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. She was a member of the expert panel on prioritizing climate change risks for the Council of Canadian Academies in 2018 to 19, and currently serves as a director of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. Most important of all, of course, she is also an associate of the Harris Center and a longtime Harris Center Advisory Board member and co-chair of our ForecastNL Steering Committee. Welcome, Elizabeth. Kieran Hanley is the Executive Director of the Newfoundland and Labrador Environmental Industry Association, NIA. Kieran has worked within the clean tech and environmental services sector for over 8 years, making him one of the province's subject matter experts on clean growth and the economic development associated with it. Kieran has an MBA, Community Economic Development from Cape Breton University, a Bachelor of Commerce, International Business with Dalhousie University, and a certificate in economic development from the University of Waterloo. He is vice chair of the Economic Development Association of Newfoundland and Labrador. And Deetra Walsh is director of advocacy and communications at Municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador. She's a feminist sociologist with an academic background in labor research, geographic mobility, rural studies, and gender. In another life, or in several other lives by the list of her activities, Deetra has worked for government, taught at universities, and was a journalist. Her work at M&L focuses a lot on municipal infrastructure. Thank you all for being with us today. We're going to start off the session with a short presentation from Elizabeth to give us a brief overview of what the key economic issues are when we think about climate change. We'll follow that with a panel discussion with Elizabeth, Kieran, and Deetra, and then open up the virtual floor to questions from our audience. So get your questions ready and feel free to post them in the Q&A box. Before I turn over to Elizabeth, I want to remind everyone that we're recording today's session and it will be posted online afterwards. So even if you're not watching live, you can still pose questions for future discussion in the online forum at www.harriscenterforum.ca. Kathy Newhook and Mandy Rousel are monitoring that for our panelists and will be checking in as well, so we can continue the discussion over the coming weeks. And ForecastNL is all about the dialogue, the discussion, the back and forth. So we really hope you do engage today, but in the days and weeks to come. So now, Elizabeth, over to you to set the stage for today's session.
Thank you very much, Rob, and hello, everyone. It's a great delight to be participating in this project and in this session today, and I'm really looking forward to the comments from my fellow panelists and also from the questions and discussion in the audience. I'm going to cover a number of topics today. First, to talk about the impact of our warming world and climate change, and as that becomes more evident, what changes we're seeing in the economy and society. Second, what steps that governments are taking to address this and the enormous costs and transition that will be required. And thirdly, how these policy changes are affecting the economy. So government is taking steps to address climate change. And of course, this is now having its own effect on the economy. And then closing with just some thoughts about the horizon for success. So as you can see in this next slide, climate change is leading to very significant changes in the economy. And I'm sure that many of you will be now seeing this in your own communities and in your own lives. We're well aware of a warming climate, changing weather patterns, including more extreme weather, changes to ocean currents and the ocean environment, which of course benefit some species and hurt others, rising sea levels, droughts, floods, and wildfires, and of course, all the enormous costs as we seek to address these changes. For industry, it's food industries that are often come first to mind when we think about who's affected from business and industry from climate change. And of course, we can see that firsthand in terms of the impact in the ocean environment and the fishery, but also in terms of agriculture and the effects that droughts and changing water patterns are having on agriculture in Canada and around the world. Communities are seeing this firsthand in terms of the infrastructure risks for roads and bridges and water systems, either from flooding or rising sea levels. And of course, wildfires are having an impact in many parts of Canada. And the livelihood of all those who live in the communities is directly affected by these changes. Individuals see this in changing employment patterns, industries that may be losing out, but also just in terms of the transition to retrain for new jobs that may be coming along, or the increased costs of getting to work for in some of those industries, if you're facing higher transportation costs or having to make detours to now reach employment locations that were maybe more difficult to reach because of the changing climate. We're seeing it in terms of the increased cost for housing as individuals are required to build more resilient housing. And even though we don't think that we see in our part of the world the big health effects at this point from climate change, certainly if we were to see a significant increase on the warming side, that would expose us to greater risks and from disease and infections that currently don't have a strong foothold in our province and region. And of course, all this is particularly difficult for individuals to adjust to. And so particularly those with low incomes. So rising inequality becomes a big challenge for for us to think about. So I focused here very much on the risk side, but it's obvious from my comments that there are some winners and some losers in that, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. How big will the impact be? Well, as you know, economists just love to try and model and estimate everything, and there's all sorts of estimates on the significant costs this will pose for the economy and how this will reduce either overall growth of Canada, of many low-income countries, of the industrialized world. Suffice it to say that you can think perhaps about this in terms of your own environment. If you've looked at your costs of providing house insurance or insurance for cars lately, those costs are starting to rise as insurers face bigger risks. If we have more extreme weather, of course, it has an impact on cars and houses, and you will find yourself required to often to upgrade roofing standards or siding standards to meet the risks of more extreme weather patterns. So we've already seen how those costs are starting to have an impact on us, even at this early stage. Next, please. Governments have are taking lots of steps to target the reduction of GHG emissions into the atmosphere to limit the damage of climate change. And it's very much, of course, attributed to the focus on the emissions that are generated by human activity, and bringing those down are right down to zero as the targets now exist for 2050. It started in the most recent era with the Paris Accord, and an attempt by 194 countries, including Canada, to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Canada then moved to adopt its own national framework on climate policy, which set a standard of cutting carbon release by 30% by 2030. And they've just today announced that they're going to increase that to 40%. And as I mentioned, we've also now embarked on a new commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. And as has the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, they've endorsed that commitment in this province. Pricing is the key element of Canada's strategy, pricing carbon from the perspective that emissions to this point have been able to be released with no cost to them, and therefore this is now a price on pollution that creates an incentive to use cleaner energy options, and also will require heavy industry to become more efficient. Currently that price is $40 a ton. It'll be rising to $170 a ton in 2030. So we may not notice it now, but we'll certainly notice it as it gradually is increased. And Canada adopted a strategy to allow provinces to set their own program. All must meet a minimum standard, but there was lots of room for variation, and Newfoundland and Labrador adopted a hybrid plan with a fuel charge plus performance standards for large emitters. That fuel charge has had very little impact to date because the province adjusted down its own fuel tax while it was in the process of implementing the plan in its early stage. But as I said, as that carbon price rises, it will become more evident for those who are purchasing gas for cars or using it for home heating fuel. The big challenge, of course, is that, and that, by the way, is only the core of the strategy. There's many other provinces or many other policies that are being developed, are in place to incentivize clean energy and renewable energy, and incentivize the green tech side of the economy. Measuring progress is difficult, and we have to know if we're implementing policies that are going to work. And so the accountability framework, that attempt to try and measure how we're getting along, is a core challenge. Next, please. Now, the policies to combat climate change create winners and losers, and we're going to hear a bit of that from both Kieran and Dietra as we move along. Clearly, the carbon-intensive industries face the biggest disruption as the price of carbon rises, and that means, of course, the oil and gas sector across the country, and most specifically in Newfoundland and Labrador, and affecting, of course, provincial revenues. Large chunk of provincial revenues in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador come from royalties from the offshore oil projects, even though that's down substantially currently. And of course, affecting individuals and communities, particularly where there's employment in those industries. There are clear winners in this. Renewable energy, for example, and we've seen a tremendous drop in the price of renewable energy in areas like solar and wind. The green tech sector, which Kieran is going to talk more specifically about, and in areas like electric vehicles. And electric vehicles may be still on the horizon in the province, but of course for individual buyers, but there is an enormous move afoot to increase the fleet of electric vehicles in all sorts of other types of transportation, including trucking, buses, etc. There are clear losers on this, and it's not only, and by that I do not mean the firms who are heavy industry or those in the oil and gas sector, but it's any firm who can't adjust their business model to adapt to the realities of climate change. And there are some who are clearly still stuck in the past on that card. And of course, there are some big wild cards we still don't know about. We have a long horizon to implement this, even though we're making big commitments now. And there are some new technologies on that horizon that could really make a big contribution to success. So now moving on to my last slide on the path to net zero. That path to net zero is an important one. And it may be difficult to think that in the next 30 years, we will really be able to re-engineer the economy to substantially remove or fully eliminate GHG emissions that are man-made. Most of that will come from directly cutting emissions, and that means directly cutting emissions from power plants, coal plants, any emitters of GHG, and in changing the path of the heavy industry who rely on that, and removing it from the automobile sector, the home heating sector, et cetera, all the key areas where emissions currently occur. But that is achievable. And one recent study that we have undertaken at the Climate Institute looked at our ability to achieve this over that 30-year horizon. And what was really interesting about that was it said we don't need new technologies that are currently not commercially viable to achieve this. We can do this with the tools that we have right now. So net zero is achievable, but it needs a big commitment from governments, from industry, and from citizens. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Got to do the unmute thing. Great setup for our discussion. And I'd like to start with a question for Dietra and Kieran, and then come back to you, Elizabeth. Dietra, where do you see climate change having the biggest impact on Newfoundland and Labrador's economy?
Thanks for the question, Rob, and thanks, Elizabeth, for the great introduction and some food for thought there. Any answer that I have and will have in the duration of this panel will certainly come from a municipal perspective. And just for folks listening, municipalities are incorporated bodies in this province. Municipalities, Newfoundland and Labrador, where I work, we're the organization that represents them. There's 275 municipalities in Newfoundland and Labrador, and this is key. 75% of these municipalities have fewer than 1,000 people living in them. Now, municipalities are jurisdictionally bounded spaces, but we cannot forget that municipalities are communities. They are the communities where people live, where they work, where they volunteer. And these are the places where economies exist, thrive, and decline. So when we look to the brief that was provided for this talk, words like extreme weather, reduced sea ice, coastal communities, infrastructure upgrades, building more resilient roads, bridges, and the impacts on homeowners, along with anything else related to mitigation and adaptation, all of these impacts and these opportunities play out in and for businesses and people within municipalities. So in answer to your question, Rob, the demands for climate change resilient infrastructure and the related operational funding to support this infrastructure, but responding also to extreme climate events. This will only increase these costs, and these costs, so in terms of the economic impact, these costs are borne by municipalities and their tax-paying residents. These economic impacts are great. And as the briefing note points out, dealing with this in the context of limited, or as we would say, sometimes stagnant and decreasing tax base is the challenge. So it will play out for municipalities and in municipalities. It's going to be an economic organizational impact, and it's going to be an individual impact. So I'll start there with my comments. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Deetra, and appreciate and have you on the panel to make sure that municipal piece is covered off. So that's great. Now, Karen, you come from a more industry, but cuts across a lot of perspectives. What do you think or is one of the biggest impacts of climate change on our economy here in Newfoundland and Labrador?
Yeah, well, Rob, first I should say happy birthday to your son.
Thank you, Karen.
But yeah, so like you mentioned, we're NIA, we're the Environmental Industry Association. So we see the impacts of climate change through a bit of a different lens. Our members provide products and services that improve environmental performance, reduce risk, address climate change throughout the economy, throughout all industries. So we actually see that addressing, tackling the climate change challenge of our time is an enormous opportunity for economic growth, diversification, and innovation for Newfoundland and Labrador. Deetra mentioned, a lot of that infrastructure work that is going to be required within municipalities and with communities, and that means business, and that does mean jobs in every corner of the province. But that's just one piece of it. The opportunity extends far beyond that, and into some major industrial opportunities for the province. We kind of view, this idea of the energy transition as being obviously important to things like achieving net zero and addressing climate change. And we see the energy transition in Newfoundland and Labrador through 4 pillars. The first is low emissions, lowering the emissions in our oil and gas industry. It's a cornerstone of our economy, and it can continue to be so for quite some time, given that we do quite a bit to make it the best that we can in terms of its environmental performance. And the technological advancements and investments that are going to be required to do so in that space are quite substantial, and will have, potentially very positive impacts actually for Newfoundland and Labrador if we rise to that challenge. The second piece is electrification. We may remember that we some time ago made quite a great investment into a renewable energy project called Muskrat Falls. There are obviously some bones of contention with that project, but at the end of the day, we have quite a bit of clean electricity now at our fingertips that we can use to green operations, processes within our province. So that's another area where there's a lot of opportunity for jobs, investment, and activity. The other piece, and Dr. Brake mentioned this actually in the comments, is around hydrogen. Hydrogen is a fuel that can be created through non-emitting processes, non-greenhouse gas emitting processes, and when used, creates actually no greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really viewed as that fuel for the future. And the interest in it has intensified and accelerated to a great degree over the past couple of years, especially this past year since the onset of the pandemic. The opportunity here for our province is hard to substantiate because it can be quite enormous. We have all sorts of renewable energy assets at our disposal that we can use to create the green hydrogen that the world is going to need. And as well, we have assets in our offshore that can produce blue hydrogen, which through carbon capture can also be relatively environmentally sustainable. So that's a great opportunity for this province. It's one of the biggest areas I see for diversification and innovation and growth for our financial situation at large. So that's a great opportunity, and that really also will help unlock the renewable energy assets, the warehouse that we keep talking about in this province. Transmitting that through electricity may not be ideal in all circumstances, but if we can use it for the creation of a product, hydrogen, that kind of bypasses the transmission issue. So great opportunities there, and I'll kind of leave it at that. Ultimately we view this as a great time for opportunity for us, and the requirement is that we do so in a strategic and planned way to maximize the opportunities associated with the energy transition, net zero, et cetera. We can let all these things happen to us, or we can be a leader in the world. And we think that there's a lot to be gained from the latter.
Thanks, Kieran. So Elizabeth, you kicked us off, and you've heard what Deetra and Kieran had to say. What's your take on major impacts of climate change on the Newfoundland Labrador economy? Well,
I agree fully with what both Kieran and Deetra have said. For municipalities, it's the enormous cost of dealing with these requirements to upgrade infrastructure. It's not only bridges and roads, it's water systems of all types, and particularly for low-lying coastal communities, but also for those directly affected by flooding. The costs of these changes are way, way beyond the ability of any individual municipality, small and big, to manage. So how we manage that is going to be just a big challenge. And of course, Kieran has pointed to the very important benefits long run for electrification through the province, and how a number of industries may be able to take advantage of that. A couple of areas that haven't been mentioned. First of all, the demand for raw materials, and Labrador in particular, but also Newfoundland's role in the production of raw materials that may be particularly attractive as the demand for some of these products increases, but also the changes in the ocean environment. And of course, there's such an important focus on that with researchers at the university, in the industry generally, in terms of the fishery and other ocean-related industries in the province. And that I think will be a pivotal place to look for opportunities as we move forward.
Thanks, Elizabeth and panel. So another question for the panel. Based on all that, what kinds of supports are going to be needed? What can be done to help ease the economic impact and or seize the opportunities, as Kieran talked about? And whose job is it to put those supports in place? Deetra, how about you lead off?
Sure. So this is where it all hits the ground and what's so important. I'm going to throw out a couple of statistics that in many ways could be dated and may not take in all of the elements of the climate change costs. But the Federation of Canadian Municipalities often cites that municipalities have the responsibility for 60% of Canada's infrastructure, but access to only 10 cents on every tax dollar. So 60% of the infrastructure, but access to only 10 cents on every tax dollar. When we look at the costs estimated, and again, these are a little dated for us now for municipalities, Newfoundland and Labrador, in terms of what is required to upgrade wastewater systems in the province. And for anyone who doesn't know, we are subject to regulations with the wastewater system effluent regulations, which is under the federal legislation. That would cost to upgrade and to get to a base point, $600 million. And $400 million for upgrades in our drinking water systems. So that's over $1 billion already, and those are dated statistics. So, you know, when we talk about, and we're not even talking about the climate change dimension yet. So when we talk about what kinds of supports are needed, and Elizabeth mentioned this, you know, it's much more than, you know, even what an individual municipality could bear. So thankfully, with respect to climate change, I believe we're at a point now where there is acknowledgement of the issue nationally. There's political will nationally. And if you look to the budget document that was released on Monday, particularly Chapter 5, you'll see pieces of that. And I encourage viewers, if you haven't waded through it, just go in and go to Chapter 5 and have a look. So there is political will. And we have to do now a little bit more of the planning around that. Municipalities do not have the economic capacity to address all of this. They are the least, they have the least economic organizational capital to address this. So we need support. And I know, Rob, you've written and talked about that on a number of occasions. And you know, that's at the heart of what we all talk about. So while local advocacy and decision-making and policy are all important levers, and they do happen at the local level. And again, I encourage anyone who cares about climate change, environment, social justice to consider running in the fall 2021 municipal elections here in this province. This is a place where you can make a difference in your community on these issues. And while you can do that, we do need resources and supports from other levels of government. We need to work together. This includes clear policy made in partnership with municipalities. It includes the availability of funding, but not only just funding. And again, on Monday, there were a lot of announcements of particular funding streams, and there are ones that already exist that municipalities can access. But it's how you can access that type of funding. So we need to empower municipalities to make the right decisions through flexible, multi-year funding so they can plan, they can address their needs, and they can get the funding in ways that also doesn't be too administratively burdensome. And we released our COVID impact report last week. I'll put it in the chat in a second after I'm stopped talking to demonstrate this. You know, municipalities need flexibility to address the issues they face, and they need the resources and the support. I can get into in the conversation afterwards some of the streams that were announced on Monday, and I'm sure we'll talk about it as well. I'd just like to note that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has been a big leader on advocating for access to this kind of support, particularly for smaller communities. Again, municipalities can't put in huge shares on their own. So asking them to put in 50% on a funding cost share arrangement when they only have 500 people in the community, that's impossible. That is not going to work. So again, flexible arrangements that enable them. So I'm going to stop there, but I have a lot more pieces and I hope we get to come back to them in the conversation.
Thanks, teacher. Karen, who needs to do what? Obviously, lots of things. What would be the thing you'd highlight?
Yeah, well, I guess if our position is that Newfoundland and Labrador is in a great place to attract substantial investment, create new jobs, and become an engine for clean and green innovation, what is ultimately needed are clear strategies, goals, objectives, timelines in place so that we can all row in that same direction. And that's a little bit more complex and nuanced than, you know, it first appears. It's harder to do than it is to say. And a really good example of that is, you know, the calls we hear sometimes for, say, the province to move away from oil and gas. I think in the long term that, you know, certainly is kind of where we need to go. But that's a hard thing to say when that industry is such an engine of our economy. We can't just turn our backs on that and turn towards other areas, because right now there aren't opportunities in other areas for the folks that work in that industry to turn to so easily. So we need to think about, what does the energy transition, what does net zero, what do these things look like? What do green jobs mean in the Newfoundland and Labrador context, and how do we enable them, and how do we help grow them? So that's the kind of work that needs to be done in order for us to maximize, I guess, the economic positives associated with climate change, net zero, and these things. It's a space that NIA is working on quite actively, trying to do its part. And I think the important part of your question is, who's responsible for this? Personally, I think too often we look to the provincial government to answer all of these questions for us, to set the stage for all of this growth. I think there's lots that we can do, to be honest, on the outside of government, to help establish priorities. And of course, the province is a very important partner in all of these things, and plays a great role as an enabler. But there's more that we can do, I think, as interested parties outside of the walls of the Confederation building to push and to pursue these things. So I'll leave it there. There's a bit of a debate, I think, there, and this is in the chat room on the use of hydrogen, and that's one of these nuanced areas that we really need to develop strategies for. Domestically, it's in our interests to electrify most things, electric cars versus hydrogen cars, but hydrogen is an opportunity to export a huge new commodity, similar to oil and gas, where we don't use that stuff necessarily. We don't mine that necessarily for our own domestic use. We use it to export it. So that's what we need: clear pathways, clear long-term plans towards 2050, if that's the target we're all looking at.
Thanks, Kieran. And you're right, there's lots of activity in the chat. I see some great questions there. So I will have Elizabeth speak to this last question, but I'm going to skip the final question for the panel so we can get to the audience. Elizabeth, you do a lot of work nationally and internationally, but you also know Atlantic Canada inside out. What's your take on who needs to do what as a priority now?
Well, I thought Kieran's point about the continuing importance of the oil and gas industry to the province as we manage this transition to net zero is an important one. And that has to be, so looking at a strategy that gets the province from where it is currently to where it would like to be over that 30-year horizon to net zero. I think it's really important. We're obviously playing our small part through the Harris Center in terms of getting people thinking about this, but for the province to embrace a full strategy and put a little more muscle behind its commitment to net zero, I think would be extremely useful. In my view, the focus needs to stay on the importance of carbon pricing. You'll know how controversial this was. Several provinces took it to the Supreme Court to complain about the federal government's right to have ability to exercise this mandate in their jurisdictions. That they lost that fight, but we still haven't fully resulted in a full picture of how this could be implemented going forward. So keeping the lever on that's the main vehicle through which government can raise revenue to distribute and invest in new sectors of the economy that will take us to net zero is really fundamentally important. And then, as I mentioned, getting good information on how effective our policies are is absolutely pivotal. We will all be able to point out examples of government having made big mistakes in terms of incentivizing various industries or sectors that where little was achieved. We can't afford to do that on climate change. We have to be very disciplined and also be governments have to be fully transparent with citizens so that we can make good choices on the most efficient programs to support in the future.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, panel, for a great exchange thus far. And I know we have a load of people on today, and it's your turn now. If you want to As some of you have already done, type in a question into the Q&A. Or if you'd like to ask a question yourself, we can put you on. Just say that you want to do that in the Q&A box. Kathy Newhook has been keeping track of all these. So Kathy, over to you. Which question do you have ready for our panel?
Sure. I've got a question from Josh Lepowski. Could the panelists comment on framing global warming in terms of costs? I keep hearing costs and cost to the economy, but even on those terms, one person's cost is another person's income. So why is the issue just cost, full stop?
I expect Elizabeth has given some thought to that question before. Elizabeth, did you want to weigh in first?
Sure. Well, we talk about it in costs in terms of the risks of climate change and the costs that might occur to business or government or individuals as the negative impact of climate change becomes apparent. But I think the better way to think about this is it's not just the cost, it's what is most efficient. What can we do that leads us to the most efficient solutions? It's just like anything you might do on the local level or within your own home. You don't mind doing something that you feel will put you further ahead. You don't mind acquiring those costs if you feel you've got a good return out of it. So it's not just a matter of cost and spending money. It's the best cost allocation we can make to improve the greatest outcome in terms of climate change.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Deidre, did you have a succinct response to that one?
I do. I'm going to theatrically improvise now and build upon what Elizabeth has offered in this. And thank you, Josh, for that good question. I like to think about it as investment. Cost makes it sound, and I know Elizabeth mentioned this earlier, cost makes us sound as though it's a means to an end, like it's something that just stops. And maybe that's what you meant, Josh. I think if we think about it in terms of investment, it enlivens it a little bit and makes us think about it from the perspective that, you know, we need to, and similar to what Elizabeth is talking about, we need to invest in this in the right way so it actually doesn't have increasing negative impacts. And again, from a municipal perspective, that's why things like asset management and planning are so critical. Good investment. I mean, when I ream off these statistics and when I look at where some of our members are at, you know, it's that they don't have the right size solutions for the situation they're in. They're dealing with old infrastructure that isn't resilient. And, you know, so we have to think forward of investing in the right kind of infrastructure for our community so that it isn't a matter of cost per se. It's a matter of good planning and, you know, over the long term. And yeah, so I would leave it at that.
Thanks, Deidre. Kieran.
Yeah, well, I think Josh is speaking my language there for sure. Electrification is a very good example of this. So if you have a building that runs on fossil fuels for heating and you switch it over to be, you know, to have electric heating, there's a cost there, absolutely. But there's a benefit there for the people doing the work. And the people that are doing the work tend to be my people. So certainly there's a lot of benefit to that. And we would encourage that. But, you know, taking that example and kind of applying it from a broader perspective, if you string an electricity line out to one of our offshore platforms, there's an enormous cost associated with that. But the operational costs are likely to be much lower for an offshore asset. The environmental costs are likely to be a lot lower. And by the way, our rates that we pay are going to be lower as well. So I agree. I mean, there's obviously, there's costs, there's benefits, but ultimately when you're talking about these things from an environmental and sustainability perspective, as Deidre said, investment is the right terminology, I think, to use here, because typically when you're adapting to or mitigating effects of climate change, whatever you're doing is going to be more resilient and it's going to be better in those regards. So it is truly an investment in the future, no doubt.
Thanks, Kieran. Kathy, next question.
All right, the next question is from Lev Tarasov. At some point, the NL oil and gas sector will have to shrink and eventually end. What are the key possible economic replacements for Newfoundland and Labrador, and what relative role do you think they will contribute? What policy steps are missing to enable this transition?
Thanks, Lev. A question we all wonder about, I think. Karen, I'm looking at you on the big screen. Why don't you continue?
Sure. And, this goes back to some of my earlier comments. In the same way that today we extract oil and we export it, I think the best comparison to that is the creation of hydrogen and the export of hydrogen. I think that is probably the most prolific opportunity that we have at this point. And it does allow for this transitionary period, by the way, because hydrogen can be created by using renewable energy, whether it be the hydro that we have, or whether it be new renewable energy developments, onshore wind, offshore wind, solar. The opportunities are going to be there. But it can also be created by using natural gas. And we do have a wealth of natural gas offshore. And you can produce it using carbon capture technologies that ensure that it is done in a sustainable manner. So that provides a very interesting kind of pathway from oil and gas to green hydrogen, with kind of blue in the middle there to help us get from A to B. So that's the best example I can give of how we move from oil and gas and move onwards from oil and gas. And with the caveat being that, a transition is a transition. It's not a snap change. It's something that does take time. And for the good of our economy, we have to make sure that we get this right. So this is a subject that is of critical importance, absolutely critical. We have to frame this strategically in the very short term.
Thanks, Kieran. Elizabeth and Deetra, don't feel obliged to answer every question, but Elizabeth, did you want to weigh in on this one?
Well, I just want to comment that I think this is one of the biggest challenges that the province will face over the next 10 years or so. I can't speculate where things will go past that, but it's such an important industry in terms of its contribution to current output, even though it's down substantially from its peak. The province has a very substantial per capita deficit at the moment, and one of the biggest in Canada, so it doesn't have a lot of room to really move on this side. So the transition path is going to be really, really tricky. But nevertheless, I think even without climate change, some of those changes would be happening anyway. And we really have to look very carefully at what role the federal government will play in helping. Remember, it's not only Newfoundland and Labrador who's in this boat, it's also particularly Alberta, so we have large sections of the Canadian population who are very closely impacted by this move away from a dependence on fossil fuels for the revenue base. So there's going to have to be a lot of very careful negotiating to make sure that that path is supported by the federal government.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Deetra, anything from a municipal perspective on this one? No?
I mean, there's so much one could say, but I know there's lots of questions, and I can cover some of my points on this in other answers, I think. Thanks.
Great. Kathy, next one up from the audience.
Okay, we've got a question from Ismail Gall. It seems that combating climate change in Newfoundland and Labrador requires the presence of several actors from municipalities, governments, intermediary organizations such as NIA, government, and others. My question is, do we already have the structure for cross-functional cooperation to accelerate and expedite the transition to net zero carbon? If not, who and how can we address this?
That's a superb question. I would say. Deetra, why don't you go first on this one?
So, like anything, I think, we always have structures for collaboration and working together. It's always a matter of political will on some instances and openness to doing that work together, and then making sure that the mechanisms are in place. I think, from our perspective, we're doing great work with the memorial, we're doing great work with the college. There's a lot of fabulous thinkers, doers, innovators, and a lot of great relationships with the levels of government. We just have to keep it moving in the right direction that has meaningful change for communities and for the organizations impacted by this.
Thanks, teacher. Elizabeth, on this one.
I think I'll pass. I think you should answer this, Rob, because this is right up your alley.
It's why I got hung up there in transitioning to the panel, but not my job today. But Kieran, I know you're big on this too.
Yeah, I think that's actually a phenomenal question, and there is no answer to it at this point. Even within, say, the way our government is structured, there's multiple government departments, obviously, who would have to deal with climate change, either from the impact or opportunity perspective. There's our Department of Industry, Energy, and Technology. We have an Environment and Climate Change department. We have a department responsible for municipalities. We have a department responsible for transportation and infrastructure. So the list goes on, and all of these areas are so critically important when it comes to that plan that we put in place to actually achieve net zero. In my mind, between all of those departments and then the other actors that you mentioned, such as municipalities, Newfoundland, such as the universities and the colleges, such as organizations like NIA, no, I do not think that there is a structure in place at this point in time to strategically address this. So that's an important gap that I think you've identified. It's a clear and present danger in my mind in terms of how we tackle all of this.
And certainly the Harris Center has done lots of work in this area over the years. And Kathy, take note for possible future focus on issues like this in future sessions. Kathy, another question.
I am wondering if we can allow a person to speak there. John, are you ready with that?
We're certainly willing to allow a person to speak.
Yeah.
So
Or willing, I
would
give John a heads up. I wanted to make sure that he knew he was on the hook for this.
Sure.
So I think Craig wanted to make a comment, and then we also have Dr. David Brake, who would wish to do so as well. So maybe we can do two in a row, and then panelists can respond to both. I'm taking over your moderation role, Rob, but feel free to override that.
No, I think that's great, Kathy. I will do like I've started to do with the panel. We can go a little past 1 o'clock. I know some people are fitting this in on their lunch hour. John, you can keep doing your thing in the background there so that we get those people on. I will emphasize for folks coming on, please introduce yourself briefly, but also be succinct, because we want to have the dialogue and we want to get in as many questions as we can. Are you good there, John?
I think Craig's on the air.
Good morning or good day. I'm Craig Lewis. I'm from Fer de Lis. I was born here in Newfoundland, but I was in the military. I traveled around a bit, did a few things. But in the last 5 years, I've been doing a lot of research into graphite and graphene, and I believe that is the future for Newfoundland and Labrador. We potentially create tens of thousands of jobs and possibly bring in hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars, depending on the products that we create from this material. It's fascinating what this can do for our world. We can take just salt water, put it through a graphene filter, it comes out crystal clear. Now, half the towns in our province are on boil water orders. We need to get clean water to our people. We can do that. We need to get organic, locally grown food on this island and in the big land of Labrador. That's our priorities. And then we can start looking at cleaning up our environment. The oceans need to be cleaned up. And by 2025, all the septic sewer water has to be cleaned before it goes into the oceans. Nobody's doing anything on that yet. And here we are talking about, carbon credits and everything else, but most of that money is going to leave Canada. It's going to be going to developing countries. It's not staying in our country. We need to develop our homeland first before we start taking and trying. Newfoundland is an emerald in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, unpolished. We have a potential to be an example to the world, to showcase what 530,000 people can do with all of their natural resources, their intelligence, and their ability to work at something together. We need to get back to spirit. in Newfoundland. And we need to be the first in the world again to actually achieve something, to make an example for the world to look upon us and say, we're going to Newfoundland because they're doing it right. Just like Norway did it right and Iceland is doing it right. We need to be next.
Greg, that's great. I think that probably is very much close to the hearts of Kieran and Deetra from the tech and the municipal side. But Kieran, any comments, response to Craig on this one?
No, I would just echo his last comment there. I think we have to embrace, we have to take some risks. We have to embrace the idea that, yes, we can be the leaders in some of these areas. As a people, sometimes we are risk averse and we wait for things to be proven elsewhere. We are a late adopter of technologies. We are a late entrant into industries. I would suggest that, I've talked a lot about hydrogen today, probably too much, but that's an area where if we're going to make the most of the opportunity, we have to be an early entrant. So yeah, I would kind of riff off Craig's comment about, not being afraid to lead.
Thanks, Kieran. Deetra, did you have anything to add to this one? I
would just simply echo that, the idea of being able to be in risk and take risks. I think that's so critical. I think about Elsa in Frozen, and if anybody's got kids, that into the unknown as she's sort of staring and boldly going. I think to Craig's point, to Kieran's point, we need to go into the unknown, take a little bit of risk, and really build upon the innovation that's happening here. So thanks.
Super. Elizabeth, I suspect you anything you want to add to this one?
No, I'll go on to the next question.
Great. John, are you ready with our next questioner to come on?
Bring Craig, Dr. Break up now.
Hello. Nice to have an opportunity. Yes. Hello. Nice to have an opportunity to meet you all. Yeah, I guess what I'm concerned about at the moment is a little bit of a vacuum of numbers. I haven't seen any recent. I went looking around the government website for recent figures on our emissions. They seem to only go back to like 2018 or so. I haven't. I believe we're waiting on an interim report on how we're doing on our climate plan, but I don't know when we're going to see it. I'm particularly from the point of view of the economy question here. I was wondering what whether there are any solid numbers been provided about the cost of the mitigation that would be necessary in 2030 or 2050, where it would fall, the specific dollar costs, the specific dollar positives and negatives on agriculture, fishing, and tourism. Do we have those numbers? And who is, if we don't have them yet, who's going to be providing them? Because we get a lot of warm words so far, but nothing like figures, I think, to prompt action.
Thanks, David. Great and important question. Getting precise dollars on this stuff, I suspect, is difficult. Elizabeth, you're the economist. Any immediate answer you have for this?
That's an excellent question, and I think you need to keep pushing the province to, as part of the push to have a well-established strategy to net zero. That should be a key component of it, that regular monitoring and transparent data is released to the public, so they know, so we all understand completely what kind of progress we're making. On the cost of mitigation, it is not possible to fully capture those costs at the moment. When we were working on the climate risk panel for the CCA, we actually could not get the data to allow us to quantify those risks. They're simply not available. It's too complex, and there's not enough work being done. If you think of, and you may know something about environmental statistics, we simply have had such a poor effort on data collection in this area that we just don't have. This is all new, and we don't have that data availability. But I will close by saying there is a very nice little report, 20-page report on the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council website on the Newfoundland economy, that was published in January of this year, and gives a kind of a nice synopsis of where things stand just on the economy side. Doesn't give you all the environmental data that you're looking for, but gives you a good briefing of where things sit at the current time.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Kieran, anything to add to this one?
Yeah, I guess I think the published numbers, I believe there's a lag that you will see depending on when Stats Canada will actually publish some of the greenhouse gas emissions numbers. So that may be part of the issue that you find when you're going looking for them. In terms of numbers for specific industries, definitely difficult to quantify, but I am aware of some work that is happening in this space in Newfoundland and Labrador, joint federal, provincial, and industrial approaches to understanding the threats, the impacts, and then trying to wrap heads around costs. And that's going kind of on an industry by industry level, whether it's fisheries or tourism. So that work is certainly being done. I wouldn't say that this is a space that nothing's being done. I think that it's a very challenging area of work, and there are those that are definitely picking away at this. And I expect in the time to come, we're going to have a much better idea of kind of what's going to be required here.
Thanks, Kieran. Dietra, anything you'd like to add to this one?
Oh, yes. Data collection is political. Let us not forget that. And as data collection is resourced and when it's resourced, and we have to think about the impact over the past, not more recently, but in the previous federal government, the impact on Statistics Canada and the kinds of data collected and how it collected at levels in, rural areas, Rob. Certainly, some of these things were eradicated in terms of knowledge. We do a very bad job at collecting good data. We do an even worse job at connecting those data at administrative levels that make sense. So we might have fragmented data all over the place, even within government, but it's not linked. It's not accessible. It's not transparent. People can't read it. These are some of the problems. And I think we do need to address that so that we can support, local communities in even having data. And I know there's some projects inside the Harris Center that are supporting those kinds of activities, but we have to do more of that. And I just want to, to this end, again, I invite you, this is not my endorsement for the federal budget, but as a point of interest, you should look at Chapter 5. There's a section there for better understanding our environment and an infusion of $25.6 million over 5 years to Statistics Canada to do this very kind of work that we're talking about. So it's a matter of, if you say you're going to do it, please do it. Please make it accessible. And please let us have input, the experts on data collection. I know Tom is on the line here, who's been doing a lot of this work on infrastructure data. Let those people inform what data is collected and how it's available to everyone. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dietra. Just showing the brilliance of our panel on this question, folks. Thanks, David, for the question. We are a little after 1. If you do need to leave, you can join back on the Harris Center Forum site, because this will be digitally recorded and the conversation will be continuing online. But we will fit in 5 or 10 minutes, another couple of questions if we can. Kathy, anything lined up?
I don't have anything lined up because I thought we were out of time, but I know that you had one left in the bag if you want to try that one.
No, I'm happy. We did debate whether we could go over, but we respect people's schedules, and we do really love the fact that we have the online forum. Maybe very quickly, I'll start with Dietra. Any final quick summation for the topic today?
I'm always trying to be optimistic in these things. I think there are opportunities. We're brilliant people. We've been doing good things. We can do more good things. We just have to work together, and we really have to support municipalities and local communities and all of the context. When I say that, people in their communities need support. They are impacted by this. We need to support decision makers at the local level, and we need to work together on this goal, because if we don't, there will be huge impacts, and Elizabeth noted that. So I'm optimistic that we can take risks, work with students, work with municipal leaders, and really do some innovative work with innovators in the business side, and get to where we need to go, and be a leader, as was suggested. So thank you, and thanks for having me.
Thanks, Deetra. Karen, last thoughts from you.
Yeah, I think we should recognize that, as a people, the speed at which we are educating ourselves or becoming educated, however you want to look at it, on these issues and topics, challenges, opportunities, is unprecedented. The degree of sophistication that we're seeing in the conversations that we're having in venues exactly like this one has changed dramatically, even over the past year. And it's not even apples to apples if you try and compare it to the discussion 5 years ago. So I think that's something to be proud of, to be honest. I think there's a lot of hard work ahead. I think that it's clear that our federal government has a lot of interest in trying to move the needle on everything we're talking about here today. And I think it's incumbent on us to establish what our priorities are. We haven't necessarily done that well up to this point. So when it comes to climate change, when it comes to energy transition, when it comes to that pursuit of net zero by 2050, how are we going to do it? What are the top 5 things that we need to do in order to make that happen? And if we collectively can get there, perhaps with the help of venues exactly like this, then we stand a much better chance of making the most of the opportunity on one hand, and then also meeting the needs of the communities and the municipalities on the other hand. So that's where I'll leave that.
Thanks, Karen. Last word to Elizabeth.
Well, I just want to thank everybody, fellow panelists, and the Harris Center staff, and all the contributors. There's a great dialogue going on online or in the chat at the moment, which is right up my alley, about data and how we improve the situation. And the province has such potential and also lots of opportunity in terms of how it implements its own strategies going forward on climate change. So I'm going to be watching and participating in this over the next year, and really looking forward to see what emerges.
Thanks a million, Elizabeth, Deetra, and Kieran. Great job. I want to remind everybody online, please visit www.harriscenterforum.ca to register to take part in the full ForecastNL project. As Elizabeth mentions, it's going to be going on for over a year, and we'll have a whole series of next steps. By registering, you'll be able to watch and rewatch any of the sessions, read other content and information, because we're supplementing these forums with that information. We have a knowledge mobilization committee that includes a whole whack of organizations with a stake in all this. And most importantly, we want you to take part in the discussion forums online. Suggest topics, ask any further questions you might have related to today's panel. They will be keeping track. Kathy and Mandy will be keeping track. And we'll keep that dialogue going with the facts where we have them, with the important questions where we don't, and pointing to next steps in trying to fill some of the gaps. Our next session is scheduled for May 6th, and it will focus on the impacts of climate change in Labrador. In many ways, Labrador is on the front lines of climate change, already seeing significant changes that are having tremendous impact on the way of life and culture in Labrador. We have an excellent panel lined up for that session, so be sure to register so you don't miss out. There's more information on the Harris Center website and on the discussion forum. Thanks once again to our panelists for a superb job. Thanks to the Harris Center team, always amazing, Kathy, Mandy, and all the rest. Thanks to John and Conference Event Services at the Emera Innovation Exchange for all your tech help and superb management of this. And finally, thanks to all of you. As with all the Harris Center sessions over 17 years now, it's only by engaging respectfully with evidence that we're going to be able to manage our challenges and seize our opportunities. And I really think we did a lot of that here today. I look forward to more in ForecastNL. And thanks a million for your time. Have a great day. If you're around our part of the province right now, we have sunshine. We need it. We haven't had much of it. So enjoy your day. All the best.